Only 15 people saw it happen. 15 black belts standing in a circle inside a tournament gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and nervous sweat. None of them spoke for a full 10 seconds after it was over. One of them, a third degree who had trained for 11 years and watched hundreds of matches, later said he had never seen anything move that fast in his life. Not on film, not in training, not in competition. He said it like a confession. The 290-pound bodybuilder never entered another open tournament. The footage, if there ever was footage, never surfaced. And the name of the man who caused all of this? Carlos Ray Norris. Chuck to the people who feared him, which, after that afternoon, was everyone in the building. Let's go back to the beginning, because this story, like all the ones that define a legend, starts long before the moment that made it legendary. It was the early 1970s. The American martial arts tournament circuit was a brutal, ego-soaked world where size was currency and reputation was everything. These weren't padded glove, point-stop competitions with referees breaking every exchange. These were open-format floors, full contact, real consequences, real pain. Men walked in with something to prove. Men walked out with their pride reshaped. Chuck Norris had already built something unusual by that point. He had won the World Professional Middleweight Karate Championship. He had trained under Tang Soo-do masters in Korea during his Air Force service. He had competed across the country and won, repeatedly, systematically, with a stillness that unnerved opponents before the match even began. But the circuit also attracted another kind of man, the showmen, the intimidators, the ones who believed that muscles were an argument. These men looked at the tournament floor and saw theater. They flexed during introductions. They talked during warm-ups. They were built like siege engines, and they wanted everyone to feel that. What they didn't understand, what many of them never understood, is that martial arts, real martial arts, is not about the size of the engine. It's about where you aim it. His name has been protected by the people who were there, not out of kindness, out of embarrassment for what happened to him. What we know, he was 290 pounds of competition-grade muscle. He had placed in powerlifting regionals. He carried himself like a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves when he walked in. He had trained in karate, enough to enter open tournaments, enough to have earned some rank, but not enough, never enough, to have stood across from a man like Chuck Norris with any real understanding of what that meant. He'd won matches before. Big men who throw hard punches often do in mixed-level tournament settings. When you weigh 290 pounds and your opponent is rattled, size becomes technique, momentum becomes skill. He'd confused those things for too long, in too many rooms. At this particular tournament, a multi-division open, held in a gymnasium with folding chairs and handwritten brackets taped to the wall, he arrived the way he always arrived, loud, expansive, performing. He moved through the warm-up area the way a ship moves through a harbor. People stepped aside. He liked that. He saw Chuck Norris near the edge of the mat, calm, stretching, eyes forward. The bodybuilder said something to the man beside him, a comment, a joke probably. Nobody laughed. The exact sequence is reconstructed from the accounts of 3 people who were present. Their memories align on the core facts, even if the specific words have blurred over decades. The bodybuilder walked toward the center of the floor. Chuck was standing nearby, reviewing the bracket, speaking quietly to another competitor. The bodybuilder stepped into Chuck's space, not accidentally, deliberately. Then he shoved him. A flat-palmed push to the shoulder, the kind of thing that in a schoolyard signals the start of something, the kind of thing that in a professional martial arts tournament, in front of 15 ranked black belts, is either a catastrophic miscalculation or a calculated provocation designed to establish dominance before a match. It was one of those, the wrong one. Chuck Norris moved with the push. He didn't stumble. He didn't widen his stance to absorb it. He simply moved like a reed bending in water, and when his shoulder came back to center, he was already looking at the bodybuilder. Not at his eyes, at nothing. Through him, past him at some fixed point beyond the man that only Chuck seemed to be able to see. That look, that specifically empty, utterly calm look, is what 3 witnesses remembered most clearly. Not what happened next, that look. Because they all recognized in that fraction of a second that something had shifted, that the bodybuilder had done something that could not be undone.
Let's talk about who was watching. These were not casual observers. The tournament had drawn some of the most experienced practitioners on the circuit. Several were instructors. At least 2 had competed at national level. These were men who had spent years training their instincts, learning to read body language, detect telegraphed movement, anticipate intent. They formed a loose circle, not because anyone directed them to, because when something is about to happen, when the air changes the way it changes before a lightning strike, trained bodies move toward it instinctively. They had all watched Chuck compete before. They knew what they were looking at when they looked at him. A machine with patience. What the bodybuilder didn't know, what he could not have known because he hadn't been watching carefully enough, is that Chuck Norris was not a brawler. He was not a power fighter. He was not someone who overcame opponents through relentless pressure or overwhelming force. He was a technician. He fought the way a surgeon operates: precise entry, correct angle, minimum exposure, maximum result. He was, by the accounts of multiple world-class competitors who faced him during this period, the fastest counter-striker they had ever encountered. His timing wasn't early, it wasn't late. It arrived at exactly the moment when an opponent was most committed and therefore most vulnerable. The bodybuilder had just given him that moment. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds. The bodybuilder, having shoved Chuck and received nothing but that empty stare in return, made a decision. It was the decision large men often make when they mistake silence for weakness. He moved forward. Not a formal attack, not a chambered technique. A forward lean, weight shifting, shoulders dropping, the preparation for another shove, or worse. He covered 2 feet. Chuck moved. Later, one of the black belts described it as watching a thought become action with no visible gap between them. There was no wind-up, no adjustment of weight, no shoulder rotation to signal the strike. Chuck's body simply reorganized. Weight dropped, angle changed, position rotated 45 degrees in the time it takes to blink. His lead hand came up, not a punch, a deflection, redirecting the incoming weight slightly offline. In the same motion, the same continuous motion, unbroken, unpaused, his rear hand fired. The witnesses used different words for what they saw. One said it was a straight punch so fast it looked like an optical trick. One said it was a ridge hand. One said he was honestly not sure what it was because his eyes hadn't been fast enough to track the specific technique. They all agreed on one thing. It landed. And the 290-pound bodybuilder, the man who had shoved Chuck Norris in front of 15 black belts, who had treated this tournament floor like his personal theater, sat down. Not fell, sat, as though his legs simply received a message they hadn't been expecting, and responded accordingly. Chuck Norris did not stand over him. He did not raise his fist. He did not say a single word. He took one step back, he returned to his original position, and he went back to looking at whatever he had been looking at, that same fixed, empty point somewhere beyond all of them. The 15 black belts stood in silence. One of them, the one who would later describe it like a confession, said that the silence lasted 10 full seconds. He counted. He had a habit of counting in moments of shock. 10 seconds is a long time when no one is breathing. The bodybuilder eventually got to his feet. He did not ask for a rematch. He did not make a scene. He walked, carefully, with the deliberate slowness of a man managing something internal, to the edge of the gymnasium, gathered his bag, and left. He did not compete that day. 2 of the competitors present tried to speak to Chuck afterward. He was polite, brief, unremarkable. He answered their questions about the bracket. He stretched. He prepared for his scheduled match. He behaved in every way as if nothing had happened. Because to him, perhaps, nothing had. This was not a story for Chuck Norris. Stories like this don't die on the gymnasium floor. They travel. The 15 witnesses spoke, not to reporters. There were no reporters for events like this. They spoke to their students, to their training partners, to competitors they saw the following week at the next tournament. The story grew the way all true stories grow when passed through people who were actually there. It lost its embellishments and gained precision. The details that survived were specific. The time, 4 seconds. The response, none. The departure, silent. It wasn't exaggerated into a movie scene. It became something quieter and more unsettling than that. It became a reference point. Instructors used it in classes, not as a lesson in street fighting, as a lesson in composure. Do you know what Chuck Norris did when someone shoved him in front of 15 black belts? Nothing, until it was time to do something, and then everything. On the tournament circuit, Chuck Norris's name already carried weight before this incident. After it, the weight was different. It wasn't about his record anymore. It wasn't about his championships. It was about what happened when you miscalculated him. Competitors who had drawn him in brackets began to study him differently, not looking for openings, looking for something to understand, some framework that would explain how a man that quiet could produce a result that fast. Most of them never found the framework, because the framework was not technical.
Chuck Norris was not, by the standards of the competitive world he inhabited, physically imposing. He was not the biggest man on the circuit. He was not the heaviest hitter. He could not bench press 300 pounds or intimidate a room by walking into it. What he had was something the bodybuilder did not. He had genuine mastery. There is a distinction, a hard distinction, that takes years of real training to understand between knowing how to fight and having internalized fighting. One is a skill you apply, the other is something you become. Chuck Norris had spent years in Korea studying Tang Soo Do, not weekend seminars, not casual training, full immersion under instructors who had inherited knowledge that stretched back decades. He had returned to the United States and continued. He had competed, lost, adjusted, competed again. He had built a system of understanding that lived not in his conscious mind, but in his nervous system. When the bodybuilder moved forward, Chuck's response wasn't a decision. It was a reflex that had been refined by thousands of hours into something indistinguishable from instinct. The bodybuilder brought mass, momentum, confidence built on a foundation of people moving out of his way. Chuck brought precision, calibrated to the exact moment of maximum opportunity. There was no contest in those 4 seconds. There was only the difference between a man who thought he understood power and a man who actually did. The story of the gymnasium, the shove, the silence, the 4 seconds, is not famous the way championship records are famous. It doesn't appear on highlight reels. It has no official documentation. It exists the way certain true things exist, in the memory of the people who were present, passed forward through the people they taught, surviving because it contains something real. Chuck Norris went on to build a career that transcended sport, film, television, philanthropy, cultural iconography so complete that his name became a genre of hyperbole, a language people use to describe impossible competence. But the men who were on that tournament circuit in the early 70s, the ones who competed alongside him, who watched him move, who stood in circles at gymnasiums exactly like the one in this story, they don't talk about the movies. They talk about what it was like to stand across from him. They talk about that stillness. They talk about a man who had so completely absorbed the lessons of his discipline that there was no longer any gap between what he understood and what he did. That gap, the space between knowing and doing, is where most people live. It's where hesitation lives, where second-guessing lives, where the moment passes before you've decided to enter it. Chuck Norris had closed that gap. Not through talent, through years of deliberate, systematic, unglamorous work, done in dojangs that smelled like sweat, under instructors who demanded precision, against opponents who revealed every flaw in his technique.
The bodybuilder who shoved him in that gymnasium probably believed at some level that size was a substitute for that work. He learned in 4 seconds that it isn't. Nobody who was in that gymnasium challenged Chuck Norris again that day. Nobody who heard the story in the gyms, the tournaments, the training halls where it spread needed to hear it twice. They looked calm. Understand the difference. Size is a fact. Skill is a choice, and a man who has spent 10,000 hours making that choice, quietly, without audience, without applause, carries something invisible that no amount of muscle can replicate. Chuck Norris didn't win that moment in the gymnasium. He had won it years before, in training halls, in early mornings, in the accumulation of something that the bodybuilder had never bothered to build. The shove was the question. The 4 seconds were the answer. And 15 black belts, men who had dedicated their lives to understanding exactly this, stood in silence afterward because they had just watched in real time what mastery actually looks like.